A 5-year-old mute girl gave a silent signal to her therapy dog. Seconds later, he growled so fiercely that Judge Frank Caprio halted the entire courtroom in shock. What happened next left everyone speechless. Stay with us to hear the full story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. The courtroom was full. Camera flashes popped like distant lightning as reporters leaned forward, their pens poised, waiting. Every bench in the gallery was filled, curious citizens, anxious family members, even a retired officer or two in full-dress blues. Yet, amid the noise and tension, Judge Frank Caprio remained composed, a calm presence in a storm of uncertainty. He adjusted his glasses slowly and looked down from the bench. His eyes did not linger on the defendant or the prosecutors, but on the smallest person in the room, 5-year-old Emily Carter. She entered quietly, holding the leash of a large German shepherd, his fur flecked with white near a long scar on his side. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed by something too deep for a child to carry. But she walked forward with steady steps, Rex trotting faithfully by her side. Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely on the bench. "So that's her," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. The girl had not spoken a single word since the day someone tried to take her. No cries, no whispers, just silence. Now she was here, in his courtroom, and everyone was holding their breath, unsure what a silent child could possibly offer in a trial built on shaky evidence and distant memories. Emily reached the witness stand and climbed onto the chair with a little help from her mother. Her fingers clung tightly to Rex's leash. For a moment, she simply stared straight ahead, unmoving. Caprio was about to give the signal to begin when he noticed a twitch, barely perceptible, a flick of her fingers, so small it could have been missed by anyone else. The moment of stillness was broken when Prosecutor Jenna Collins stood from her table. Her voice, when it came, was clear and measured as if the truth needed no embellishment. "Your Honor," she began, glancing toward Judge Caprio before turning to the jury. "The state would like to enter for the record the charges currently pending against the defendant, Richard Hale." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Mr. Hale stands accused of attempted abduction of a minor, Emily Carter, age 5, an incident witnessed by one civilian and partially recorded on a neighborhood security camera. The defendant was positively placed at the scene by witness testimony. However, due to lack of direct forensic evidence, the prosecution relies heavily on the observations of the victim and those closest to her." Caprio watched her carefully. Jenna was young, but she spoke with the quiet weight of someone who had seen too many cases like this, cases that rarely ended with hope. She turned slightly, her eyes softening as they rested on the child. "The victim, Miss Carter, has been diagnosed with selective mutism following the event. She has not spoken since the day of the attempted abduction. She exhibits signs of acute trauma, night terrors, hypervigilance, withdrawal from familiar environments, and she currently relies on a certified therapy dog for emotional support and stability. This dog, Rex, has been cleared for courtroom presence by a state-approved child psychologist." A low murmur spread through the gallery, but Caprio tapped his gavel once, gently. Silence returned. Jenna nodded once in thanks and continued. "The defense argues that without a verbal statement or physical evidence, the accusations cannot hold. But we intend to show that communication comes in many forms, that trauma does not silence the truth, only alters the way it speaks." She stepped back slowly, her eyes briefly locking with Caprio's. Then she sat, and the courtroom once again held its breath. But not Rex. The dog's posture shifted. His ears snapped forward, his body stiffened, and a deep growl rumbled low in his throat. Not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. His gaze locked onto the defendant, Richard Hale. The room fell still. You could hear someone swallow in the back row. Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. But inside, something stirred. He'd seen dogs in court before, therapy animals meant to calm nerves, offer support. But this was different. This wasn't a trained response. This was instinct. This was recognition. Across the courtroom, Richard Hale, 45, clean-shaven, confident, shifted in his chair. His hand, which had been resting easily on the table, suddenly gripped the edge. His jaw tightened. Just for a second, just a flicker. but Caprio saw it. Something had cracked. The judge leaned back in his chair slowly, his mind already working. He'd been on the bench for decades. He'd seen liars and truth-tellers, manipulators and the manipulated, and he knew one thing better than most. Truth had a way of showing itself in moments people least expected. He turned his head toward the attorneys but spoke to the courtroom as a whole. "We'll take a brief recess," he said, his voice calm but firm. 15 minutes. Judge Frank Caprio stood alone in his chambers, the faint hum of the courtroom still echoing in his ears. He had called for a recess, officially for procedural balance, but privately, he needed a moment to think, to breathe. The reaction of that dog, the subtle motion of a child's hand, and the tightening jaw of a man accused, it all stirred something deeper than legal logic. His cell phone buzzed. He picked it up without checking the caller ID. He already knew who it would be. "Frank," said the voice on the other end, soft but alert. "I watched the morning coverage. That girl, Emily, she's not pretending. She's not just frightened, she's trapped inside something." "I figured as much," Caprio replied quietly, resting his hand on the edge of his desk. "That's why I asked for your help last week. Selective mutism. I don't know enough about it, but I need to." His old friend, Dr. Paul Hennessy, was a child psychologist with more than 30 years in trauma care. Frank trusted him, not just his expertise, but his heart. "She's not choosing to be silent," Paul said. "She's protecting herself the only way she knows how. And if that dog is the only bridge she has, don't question it. Follow it. Listen. Sometimes, Frank, the things left unsaid are the most honest of all." Frank let the words settle in the stillness. Then he ended the call, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray sky beyond the courthouse. Below, just outside the waiting room, he saw Sarah Carter sitting on a bench. Her arms were around her daughter, both of them drawn into each other like two people trying to survive the same storm. Emily's head rested on her mother's shoulder, her little fingers gripping the fabric of Sarah's coat. Neither of them spoke. Neither had to. And somewhere deep inside the silence, the past came rushing back. It had been a warm spring afternoon, the kind that made the air smell of flowers and sunlight. Sarah had been standing at the kitchen sink, laughing quietly as Emily danced in the yard in her pink dress, chasing butterflies. The phone rang. Her sister's number lit up the screen. "I'll just be a minute," she had whispered to herself, stepping inside. 4 minutes. That's all it had taken. When she came back to the window, the world had changed. The gate was open. A black van idled at the curb. A man crouched beside Emily, speaking in a voice too smooth, too practiced. "I have puppies in the van," he had said. "They're special. Would you like to come see?" Sarah didn't scream. She moved, fast. Her voice cut through the yard like glass. "Emily!" The man's head snapped around. His eyes narrowed. His hand reached for the child. But Emily didn't run. She didn't cry. She stood frozen, like something inside her had already been stolen. That image had never left Sarah. A neighbor across the street, a retired nurse, shouted. The man hesitated, just for a second. That was enough. Emily broke free and ran into her mother's arms. The van screeched away, leaving behind only the smell of burning rubber and the sound of silence. The officers were on the scene within moments. Leading the response was Judge Frank Caprio, now acting in a rare consultative role alongside the FBI's Child Abduction Task Force. By his side, Detective Jack Monroe moved with practiced authority. His salt and pepper hair and steady, penetrating eyes hinted at decades spent unraveling the darkest of human behavior, tracking cases that often led to heartbreak. This case was no different. His voice low, Monroe glanced at his notes and muttered, "Same pattern. I've seen this before. Too many times." He paused, flipping to a page marked with dates and names. 4 children in a year and a half, each one taken near their homes, each lured by talk of puppies. His partner, Agent Lisa Grant, crouched beside young Emily, her tone a calm blend of kindness and resolve. "Sweetheart, can you remember what the man looked like?" Emily gave no sign. Sarah, her mother, reached to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's ear, her hands visibly shaking. "It's all right, baby," she whispered. "You're safe. Can you tell the nice lady anything about the man?" Emily clung tightly to her mother's sweater, eyes vacant. No words came, no gestures, just stillness, as if her voice had been sealed inside her. Sarah leaned in, her voice cracking. "She's been like this since I brought her home. Not a single word." Grant met Monroe's eyes, her expression grim. "It may be selective mutism. She's likely in shock." Monroe let out a heavy breath and rubbed his forehead. "No statement, no solid lead. A man in a black van? We might as well be chasing ghosts." Just then, Martha Jenkins stepped forward from the cluster of onlookers. She had seen the attempted abduction. "I caught part of the license plate," she said, her voice clear. "The first 3 letters were YKZ. Monroe's head snapped toward her, eyes suddenly alert. "That gives us something to go on." Sarah looked down at Emily, who remained curled in on herself. In the days that followed, the child's silence grew more profound. She no longer touched her crayons, no longer looked out the window. She suggested a support animal, a therapy dog. David, Emily's father, exhaled slowly, fingers running through his hair in that worn-out way of his. "You really believe that could work?" "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past the window. "But I'm willing to try anything at this point." What neither of them realized was that this one choice would ripple through their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Because even though Emily hadn't spoken a word since that terrible day, someone was still listening. Dr. Laura Bennett's rehabilitation center had a stillness to it, sterile yet comforting. Near the window, stretched across a padded orthopedic mat, lay a German shepherd with an alert yet calm demeanor. Rex. His eyes, dark and knowing, followed every movement with unflinching attention. Once, he had been among the elite, one of the city's top police dogs, trained to protect and serve with an intelligence that had saved lives. But time and injury had carved a different path. 3 years earlier, during a nighttime raid to recover a kidnapped child, Rex had charged into danger without pause. An armed assailant had struck out with a blade intended for an officer. Rex had intercepted, taking the blow himself. Though he overpowered the man, the deep wound never quite healed. His gait changed. His stamina waned. The department, already under financial strain, had been forced to retire him. Worse yet, he'd been listed for euthanasia, considered too compromised to continue. That's when Dr. Bennett intervened. Sarah Carter sat stiffly in a chair, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. Behind her, Emily stood half-hidden, wide green eyes peering over her mother's shoulder. Since the incident 2 weeks ago, she hadn't spoken a word. Traditional therapy hadn't moved her. Laura knelt down, voice soft, kind. "Hi, Emily. I'm Laura. I work with dogs who help kids who've been through hard things." Emily didn't speak, didn't move, but she didn't run either. Her gaze shifted toward the German shepherd nearby. Rex was still. His ears perked slightly, posture relaxed, no hint of pressure in his presence. "Would you like to meet him?" Laura asked gently. There was no reply, but Emily's feet stayed rooted. That was something. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair. "He's a very gentle dog, honey. He used to be on the police force, like in your books." Laura gave Rex a subtle hand signal. "Stay." He didn't flinch. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Emily stepped out from behind her mother. Her hand rose, unsure at first, but then firm in its purpose. Rex waited. Not a muscle moved until Laura gave a nod. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time since everything changed that her daughter had willingly reached for someone. Tears filled her eyes. Emily, still silent, pressed closer to the dog, as if he were the one steady thing in a world gone unstable. In the days that followed, a bond grew between them. Quiet, unspoken, and unbreakable. Back in the courtroom days later, the investigation yielded nothing solid. A partial license plate, a vague description, a frightened child who wouldn't talk. Richard Hale was questioned but released. No prints, no confession, no hard evidence. But Judge Caprio had read the reports. Every word, every line. Something about them didn't sit right. And now here they were. Emily had withdrawn into herself, drawing dark shapes on crumpled paper, staring at corners where no one stood, flinching at the sound of tires on gravel. Her parents tried everything: soft lullabies, bedtime stories, the stuffed bunny she once adored. Nothing worked. Frank remembered one report that struck him deeply. Emily had drawn a black van. In every picture, the girl was small, barely visible, but the van was always large, its windows blank, and always, there were shadows inside it. He returned to the bench with slow steps. If there was one thing he knew, it was this: silence might be deafening, but it was never empty. All rise. The bailiff's call echoed across the hushed courtroom as Judge Frank Caprio entered, his presence composed and commanding beneath the folds of his dark robe. He took his place behind the bench, his gaze moving deliberately across the room before pausing on Emily and the dog at her side. Judge Caprio had previously authorized the inclusion of the therapy dog in these proceedings, though he was well aware that not everyone in the courtroom welcomed that decision. "Before we begin with opening remarks," he said in a calm, authoritative tone, "we'll address the matter of the support animal's presence here today." Michael Graves, the defense counsel, rose and adjusted his tie with deliberate care. "Your Honor," he began, his manner courteous yet assertive, "while we recognize the prosecution's stated reasons, the presence of this animal poses a serious concern. A German Shepherd this size in plain view of the jury risks eliciting undue sympathy, which could compromise the fairness of this trial. We respectfully request that the dog be removed during any testimony." Jenna Collins, the prosecutor, didn't hesitate. Rising swiftly, she met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, Emily Carter is 5 years old. She's endured severe trauma and has since developed selective mutism. This dog is not a prop. He is part of a therapeutic strategy, recommended and approved by her medical team, to allow her participation without emotional harm." Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his face neutral. "I've reviewed the materials provided by the child psychologist and the expert in animal-assisted therapy. The support animal will remain." A quiet ripple passed through the gallery, some nodding in quiet approval, others shifting in disapproval. Graves exhaled silently, offering no further protest. He returned to his chair and shared a wordless look with his client, Richard Hale, who sat still, his expression unreadable. With that, the trial commenced. The prosecution opened with a powerful narrative portraying Hale as a manipulator who had spent years weaving a pattern of deceit and grooming. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Among them was Martha Jenkins, a neighbor of advanced age, who described in halting, emotional detail the scene she'd witnessed, the man coaxing Emily toward his van, then grabbing her arm before bolting when confronted. Emily remained seated throughout, her tiny frame nearly lost in the oversized courtroom chair. Her small hand never strayed far from Rex's leash. Whenever anxiety crept in, she'd glance down, grounding herself through the still presence of the animal beside her. The moment soon came for Emily to take the stand. The room quieted as she was gently escorted to the witness box. Her mother, Sarah Carter, walked with her, steady and protective. She helped her daughter into the seat, though every part of her seemed torn between composure and the overwhelming urge to shield Emily from the eyes fixed upon her. Jenna Collins stepped forward with measured warmth. "Hi, Emily," she said, her tone soft and reassuring. "I know this feels a bit scary, but you don't have to speak if you don't want to. If it's easier, you can nod or shake your head. And if you ever need to pause, just let us know." Emily didn't acknowledge her. Her eyes stayed lowered, her breath light and uneven. Then, sensing her tension, Rex gently leaned against her leg. Emily reached down and clutched his fur. After a moment, she nodded. "That's great," Jenna responded, her voice steady and kind. "Emily, can you tell us who was in the yard with you that day?" Emily remained still. She didn't raise her eyes, but after a prolonged silence, she slowly lifted her arm and pointed straight at Richard Hale. He showed no reaction at first, but a subtle clench in his jaw betrayed something beneath the surface. Graves sprang up at once. "Objection!" he barked. "Your Honor, are we seriously allowing this? This is theater, emotional manipulation. This is not how a courtroom operates." Judge Frank Caprio looked at him, calm as ever, and then let his eyes drift past him, toward the rear benches where Special Agent Jack Monroe sat. Monroe's hands were folded. His expression is unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, experienced, eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, were fixed on Hale, not blinking, not moving, just watching. As Graves continued to speak, Caprio remained quiet. Then he turned to Graves and said, "Noted, but we will proceed." Sarah Carter, sitting in the front row, clutched her hands in her lap. Her face had gone pale. Emily hadn't made a sound, but she had communicated something far more powerful, and every fiber of Sarah's being told her it was real. The recess bell rang 15 minutes later. In his chambers, Caprio stood by the window, gazing out over the city's rooftops. Monroe and prosecutor Jenna Collins stood nearby. "I know I can't tell you how to run your investigation," Caprio said, his voice low, thoughtful. "But I want you both to hear this." He turned around, looking Monroe straight in the eye. "That dog," Caprio said, "did not just react to distress, it recognized him. And I believe that because I've watched enough people try to lie their way out of guilt, and I've seen the way truth shows up in unexpected places." Monroe's brow creased. "With respect, Your Honor, dogs aren't sworn witnesses." "No," Caprio agreed, "but they don't fake trauma either." There was a beat of silence. "I'm not asking you to bend the law," Caprio continued. "Just follow what you saw. Look beyond the pages." Monroe nodded once. "Then I'll follow the dog." 2 days later, Caprio sat behind his desk, reading transcripts. His phone rang. It was Monroe. "We found it," the agent said simply. Caprio leaned forward. "There's a cabin, about 70 miles north. Your hunch? The dog's reaction? It lined up with soil found on Hale's tires. We're moving in now." The call ended. Caprio sat back, his fingers steepled. For a long time, he stared at nothing. He remembered clearly that quiet moment when he first suggested the investigation, when even Monroe, a man not known for sentiment, had hesitated. Caprio had trusted more than instinct. He had trusted that healing, real healing, could uncover things that fact alone couldn't. And now, for the first time, it felt like something deeper had begun to shift. Outside the courtroom that afternoon, the tension was palpable. Reporters whispered behind cameras. Graves paced near the defense table, glancing frequently at the clock. Inside, Sarah held Emily close in the hallway. The girl's eyes were tired but clear. She hadn't spoken, not again. But when she looked up at her mother, something was different. She wasn't just afraid. She was waiting. Back in his seat, Caprio folded his hands and waited too. There were no fireworks, no shouting confessions. But Caprio knew, somewhere beyond the walls of this courthouse, the ground was giving way beneath the lies. And it had all started with the simplest of acts, a girl reaching out to a dog, a signal, a growl, a path only they could see. The forest was silent when Agent Jack Monroe stepped out of the unmarked SUV. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence that invited comfort. It was heavy, tense, the kind that held secrets beneath bark and stone. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and old wood. Behind him, a small team of federal agents followed with quiet discipline. At the front of the line, Rex strained against his leash. The German shepherd's hackles were raised, his nose to the ground, his body rigid with focus. Monroe knelt beside him, pressing one gloved hand to the ground. The soil was a near-perfect match to the sample taken from Richard Hale's van. It had taken 2 days and a forensic geologist's help to trace it to this location, an abandoned cabin deep in the northern woods, not listed in any public registry. "Let him lead," Monroe said simply, and Rex did. With a sharp bark, he darted toward the back of the cabin, stopping at a patch of overgrown weeds near the rear porch. He paced in a tight circle, growling low, then pawed frantically at a spot near the foundation. One of the agents moved in, sweeping aside leaves and debris. Beneath the layer of filth was a metal latch, rusted and nearly invisible. "There," Monroe said, "we found it." They pried open the door to a set of narrow, rotting steps. A thin light cut through the opening, falling on the dark descent below. The air that rose from it was thick, damp, moldy, laced with something far worse. Monroe was the first to descend. His flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing a cramped basement lined with concrete walls and a single cot. In the farthest corner, barely visible in the gloom, was a small figure. A girl. "Emma Sullivan?" Monroe said, his voice soft, cautious. The child stirred. Her clothes hung loose on her small frame, her eyes hollow, but still aware. She did not scream. She simply looked at him and whispered one hoarse word. "Help!" Rex whimpered sharply and pushed forward, nose twitching, tail stiff. Monroe crossed the room quickly and dropped to his knees, gently unlocking the chain at her ankle. The moment it fell away, she collapsed into his arms. "You're safe now," he said. "We've got you." Back in Providence, Judge Frank Caprio sat in his office, his hands resting flat on the desk. The call had just ended. Monroe's voice was calm, but the words had trembled with quiet triumph. The girl was alive. They had found her. Caprio leaned back slowly, the weight of years settling in his chest. "A dog, a child, and an old judge," he murmured. "Sometimes that's all it takes." He stood and straightened his robe. Court would reconvene soon. The courtroom was packed again. Press, public, and legal minds all gathered in anticipation. Michael Graves, defense attorney for Richard Hale, stood from his seat. His suit was impeccable, his posture perfect, but a slight crack had begun to show in his voice. "Your Honor," he began, "we acknowledge the unfortunate situation with the cabin and the child. But let me be clear, there is no video footage, no eyewitness placing my client at that site. Soil samples? Circumstantial. A dog's behavior? Emotionally compelling, yes, but not an admissible fact." Caprio listened without interruption. His face was calm, eyes steady. When Graves finished, the judge folded his hands. "A skilled argument," he said evenly. "But you know as well as I do, Mr. Graves, that eloquence isn't justice. Truth is, and the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it growls." There was a pause. Then Caprio turned to Emily, seated with her mother, Rex, by her side. "Bring him forward," he said gently. Rex rose, almost like he understood the request. He walked to the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Hale. The courtroom watched in complete stillness. Then Rex stopped, his body stiffened. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. Not a sound of fear, a sound of certainty. Richard Hale's eyes flicked toward the dog, then away. His jaw tightened. Graves didn't rise this time. He remained seated, shoulders tense, lips pressed thin. At the back of the room, Monroe stood with his arms crossed, watching quietly. For the first time since the case began, the old agent allowed himself a small, tired smile. The courtroom was so still, it seemed the air had forgotten how to move. Judge Frank Caprio sat at the bench, hands folded, eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. Richard Hale no longer looked like the self-assured professional who had walked into court weeks ago. The suit still fit, but the confidence had long since unraveled. His hands trembled as he stood. All eyes turned to him. Caprio waited. Hale's voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. I plead guilty." No one moved. Michael Graves, the defense attorney, remained frozen in place. His face, always composed and deliberate, now held nothing but resignation. For the first time, there was nothing left for him to argue, nothing clever to offer. He looked down at the table and said nothing. Caprio nodded slowly, then turned toward the clerk. "Let the record reflect that the defendant has entered a plea of guilty," he said, his voice low but steady. "The court sentences Richard Hale to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Then he turned his head slightly, to where Agent Jack Monroe stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, the lines of age and experience etched into his face. Their eyes met. Caprio didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was the look shared only by men who had seen too much and saved too little. But today, they had saved someone, and that mattered. In the hallway behind the courtroom, the atmosphere was softer, though still tense. Emily Carter sat on a bench, her legs swinging just above the floor. She held Rex's leash with both hands, her knuckles pale from the grip. Rex, ever steady, rested his head on her lap. Judge Caprio approached slowly, careful not to startle her. Sarah Carter stood nearby, her expression caught between pride and exhaustion. Caprio crouched down so he was eye level with the little girl. "You were very brave," he said gently. "You didn't speak, but you said something very important today." Emily didn't respond at first. Then she looked up, her green eyes meeting his. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She leaned forward, just a little, and whispered, "Thank you." The judge's chest tightened. Not from pain, but something quieter. Something closer to grace. Rex lifted his head and nudged Emily's hand with his nose. She giggled softly, a sound no one had heard from her in months. Caprio reached out and gently scratched Rex behind the ears. "You too," he said, voice warm. "You did good, old boy." He stood, gave a nod to Sarah, and turned toward the hallway. Outside the courtroom, Monroe was waiting, his coat folded over one arm. He didn't speak as Caprio joined him. The two men stood side by side, watching as Emily and Sarah walked down the hallway, Rex padding quietly beside them. There were no words between them for a long while. Finally, Caprio let out a breath. "Not bad for an old judge and a tired agent," he said. Monroe chuckled under his breath. "You said to follow the dog. I followed the dog." Caprio smiled faintly. "And you trusted me." Monroe looked at him, serious now. "Always did." They watched as the little girl paused at the end of the hall, turned and waved. Caprio raised a hand in return. Not the firm, controlled gesture of a judge, but something softer, more human. Emily turned and kept walking. The sound of her footsteps, light, free, faded slowly. And for the first time in a long while, Caprio felt something return to the space behind his ribs. Hope. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet courage still matters, don't forget to leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe in the quiet heroes of this world. Subscribe for more stories like this, where broken things still have worth, and the smallest voice can still change everything. Until next time,